distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute for Human Rights, I would like to welcome you to the side event dedicated to the UPR process in Turkmenistan. We would like to thank the OHCHR for the possibility to address key international stakeholders on the pressing issues of human rights situation in Turkmenistan in the view of its UPR. It's indeed a unique opportunity for the civil society to participate in the dialogue with the international community, as the local authorities of Turkmenistan refrain from any cooperation with the civil society.
Dear colleagues, thank you.
Turkmenistan is well known for being a highly conservative country with literally no environment for human rights defenders and independent media. The government of Turkmenistan already received numerous recommendations to guarantee the freedom of expression, association, and movement during its previous review, but still no efforts undertaken to implement positive changes into local policies. Today we are privileged to have members from Turkmen civil society on site, Ms. Bigmeleva Tajigul and Mr. Khadjiyev Anandurdi, who represent Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights and restlessly advocate for human rights and freedoms in the country. We strongly believe that their personal testimonies will broadly contribute to the comprehensive understanding on the accurate human rights situation in Turkmenistan. Thus, with no further ado, I would like to open the discussion with the pre-recorded statement of the Human Rights Watch Deputy Director of Europe and Central Asia Division, Ms. Rachel Denver.
Dear colleagues, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join this side event on Turkmenistan. I wish I could be in Geneva with you in person, but I'm very happy to be sending this video. I just want to say a couple of very short things, because I know that the details of the human rights situation in Turkmenistan will be covered comprehensively by the esteemed members of this panel. What I really want to say is that I think it's too easy to become complacent about universal periodic review, but for a case like Turkmenistan, the UPR is extremely important because for two key reasons. One is that the government does everything it possibly can to avoid, to prevent, and indeed to punish any kind of scrutiny of its human rights record. It's very rare that Turkmen human rights defenders who sadly have to work in exile, it's very rare that they have the opportunity to actually be in the same room with their government officials when its human rights record is under scrutiny. And the second reason is because the government does not only everything it can to prevent scrutiny, it does everything it possibly can to prevent any kind of information, not only about the human rights situation, but about any other aspects of social and political and economic life in the country, from any accurate information from circulating and from getting out of the country. So it spares no effort to censor media, to prevent people from engaging on social media platforms, to bar things like virtual private networks, to prevent people from communicating with each other effectively. It severely punishes dissent, and it doesn't allow any independent NGOs. So it's very difficult to get information about Turkmenistan's human rights record, and that's, again, another reason why it's so important that delegations attend the UPR in Turkmenistan, and then that they put forward robust recommendations on the wide range of topics that you will hear my colleagues discuss today. For Human Rights Watch's submission on UPR submission on Turkmenistan, just go to our website. You'll see our recommendations and our analysis of the situation in Turkmenistan on issues such as the situation for civil society, such as it is, on enforced disappearances, on freedom of movement, on food security, and a couple of other issues. Meanwhile, let me wish you a productive session, and I very much look forward to seeing some robust recommendations being
to the Turkmen government. Thank you very much.
We thank Ms. Denver for her intervention, and I would like to turn to Ms. Bigmeleva, who is present with us today. She will brief us on her 2023 UPR submission and elaborate on the situation with political prisoners, political persecution, and the freedom of expression. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to know about real human rights situation in Turkmenistan and abroad. Our memorandum presented jointly by the TurkmenHelsinkiFond Foundation for Human Rights and Bulgarian Health Committee examines important aspects of the human rights situation in Turkmenistan in the lead-up to the incoming UP. The document addresses issues related to the persecutions of civil activists and dissidents at home and abroad, the problem of the disappearances, respect for human rights during campaigns against extremism and terrorism, restrictions on freedom of movement, including those related to the problems of documenting Turkmen migrants in Turkey. Persecution of civil activists. There are no registered opposition parties, independent non-governmental organizations, or non-state media in Turkmenistan. Bloggers, civil activists, and dissidents who publicly criticize the government are under pressure, whether they are at home or abroad. Pressure on their relatives is widely practiced. Such pressure increased markedly after a new protest movement emerged among Turkmen migrants in Turkey in 2020, which tried to establish contacts with activists within the country. The reason for the emergence of the protest movement were many years of government neglect of social, economic and political problems, including the unsettled status of hundreds of thousands of Turkmen migrants, which worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lawyer Peygamber Geldi Alaberdi from Balkan City became a victim of persecution due to his social activity and contacts with foreign dissidents. He was detained on September 7, 2020 on trumped-up charges of hooliganism, and on September 29 he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. In 2022, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found Laberdiev's deprivation of liberty to be contrary to Turkmenistan international obligations and recommended that the government immediately release him from custody without conditions, ensure the right to compensation and conduct an investigation into the circumstances of his arbitrary deprivation of liberty. The recommendations have only been partially implemented. On December 10, 2022, Alberdiev was released under an amnesty, but he was placed under administrative supervision for 5 years, during which he must report to the police and is deprived of the right to freedom of movement. His request to the authorities to allow him and his wife to travel abroad for treatment remains unanswered. An investigation into the circumstances of the arbitrary deprivation of liberty has also not been carried out. Video blogger Murat Dushemov was repeatedly detained and tried on the basis of fabricated material. In June 2021, after publishing a video criticizing the authorities' action during the COVID pandemic, he was fined for violating public order. On July 7, 2021, he was subjected to administrative arrest for 15 days. After that, on August 2021, the court sentences him to 4 years in prison. Dushemov's relatives report that he still cannot receive a copy of the verdict, which is why he was unable to appeal in a timely manner. Persons involved in other politically motivated cases in Turkmenistan also complain about the refusal to provide copies of court decisions. Rozgeldi Choliyev, who studied in Russia, came under pressure from the authorities after they posted a video message on Turkmen opposition channels on YouTube in May 2020 related to the social problems of students studying abroad and the lack of help from the Turkmen embassy, then several more videos. Almost immediately, the Turkmenistan consulate informed the Russian authorities that the student was involved in terrorism and asked that he be handed over to Turkmen diplomats who would send him home. At the same time, pressure began on his relatives in Turkmenistan. Since June 2020, the Turkmen authorities have been putting pressure on the relatives of Nursultan Taganova, who has in the Turkmen protest movement created in 2020 by migrants from Turkmenistan in Turkey. Taganova's relatives were repeatedly called to the police, demanding that she be convicted. Some were subjected to physical violence. On October 12, 2020, police informed her brother in Turkmenabad that Taganova was a traitor to the motherland. On August 16, 2022, Turkmen activists who came to the consulate of Turkmenistan in Istanbul to deliver an appeal to the president about the problems of migrants were beaten in the courtyard of the consulate by unknown masked men who came out of the building of consulate. The incident occurred before the eyes of the accompanying activists of Turkish human rights activists and lawyers. One of the Turkmen activists, Adamrat Saparov, received a serious injury to the head and face and was forced to seek medical help. The Turkish authorities are currently investigating the incident. Turkmenistan still has not fulfilled the recommendation of the UN Human Rights Committee on the cases of Sapar Muradova, Sapardurdi Hajiyev, and Anna Kurban Amanklich. We are talking in particular about the conduct of an impartial and thorough investigation and holding the criminals accountable, the provision of compensation and complete information, as well as the adoption of measures to prevent such violation in the future. In March 2023, representatives of Turkmenistan, despite the fact that in 2006 the court of Ashgabat sentenced Sapar Muradov to 6 years in prison, made an absurd statement that she was allegedly not prosecuted at all. Turkmenistan continues to use Interpol procedures to prosecute dissidents and refugees, as was the case in 2007 in relation to dissident Anadolu Hajiyev. In particular, in 2019, a request was sent to Austria about the extradition of the former ambassador of Turkmenistan in Turkey, Nur Muhammed Khanamov, who has been living on Austria since 2003 as a refugee. Earlier, Turkmenistan has already demanded his extradition. The new request mentioned allegedly taking place in 1993, involvement in the smuggling of opium and thief of funds from the government in 2002. When Austria requested the provision of legal assistance with Turkmenistan, the Turkmen side could not fulfill the request for evidence confirming the guilt of the accused. With this in mind and other circumstances, Austria decided to close the case. Human rights violation during the campaign against terrorism and extremism. information on the implementation of the concluding observations of the UN Human Rights Committee adopted following the consideration of the second periodic report of Turkmenistan. The authorities of Turkmenistan argued that in the period 2015-2019, the court of Turkmenistan allegedly did not consider cases of crimes such as extremism and terrorism at all. That is not true. Currently, hundreds of citizens of Turkmenistan are serving long prison sentences from 12 to 25 years as extremists and terrorists, often only for their religious beliefs. With regard to this group of prisoners, the practice of promotion is widespread, that is, fabrication of new charges while serving their sentences. Until 2018, many persons convicted in cases of terrorism and extremism were kept incommunicado. Subsequently, such a regime was introduced in a number of cases for a limited time. A number of dubious criminal cases have been filed against students who studied abroad and returned home for various reasons. Murad Abdai, who studied in Egypt, returned home in March 2016 to renew his passport. He was banned from traveling abroad and was offered to become an intelligence agent among believers. After Abdai's refusal, he was detained on September 27, 2016 on a trumped-up administrative case of petty hooliganism, and then criminal charges were brought. On December 13, 2016, at the Ashgabat City Court sentenced him to 15 years in prison for conspiracy to overthrow the constitutional order, etc. The trial was closed, and his relatives still do not know what his guilt. Turkmen students Kakhajan Khalbayev and Kemal Sapar, who studied in Russia, found themselves in a similar situation. They returned home for the holidays at the end of 2017 and were arrested as extremists about 2 months later. On April 27, 2018, the court sentenced them to 15 years in prison. According to Khalbayev's mother, who was present in the courtroom, the proceeding lasted no more than 2-3 hours. Not a single witness was questioned. No specific episodes were mentioned, except for the alleged discovery of her son's computer of 2 extremist religious audio files downloaded from the internet content. There is no evidence in the case that these files were distributed by Khalbayev. Neither Khalbayev nor the lawyer were able to obtain the text of the indictment and the court decision. In connection with the same case, 10 more citizens of Turkmenistan who studied in Russia were put on the interstate wanted list. These and other examples demonstrate the general problems associated with law enforcement in case of extremism. For example, the same situation with Asherbay Bekiyev, who was last month, the court sentenced him last month in Dashos to 23 years in prison. To the list of problems, it is worth adding dubious humanitarian expertise, which plays an important role in proving associations of extremism. The possibility of challenging such pseudo-expertises, which are usually only a declarative and not always competent presentation of the expert's subject's opinion, is currently actually absent. I forgot to say about Asherbay's Biki's brother, Tachmurat, and their friends. They are in the same situation now in Russia. So, about restrictions of freedom of movement. Over the past 20 years, Turkmenistan has widely practiced restrictions on leaving the country, usually without explanation of the reasons. Also, the list of travel bans has been reduced since the death of President Niyazov in 2006, and some citizens have been able to file complaints against unfounded bans. Thousands of people remain on blacklists, and travel ban decisions continue to be made in a non-transparent manner and without a clear notification procedure. Bans remain on travel abroad for relatives of dissidents and human rights activists living abroad. For example, my relatives, I am human rights activist, and my relatives were prohibited from leaving the country until 2015 in the early 2000s. This restriction introduced for political reasons has not yet been lifted. After the introduction of new biometric passports in 2013, hundreds of thousands of Turkmen citizens living abroad, primarily in Turkey, effectively became illegal immigrants, which seriously limited freedom of movement. After the expiration of all documents, consulate, as a rule, refused to issue new ones, demanding, contrary to the law, that the citizen draw up new documents in his Turkmenistan, in the homeland. That's why the citizen draw it in Turkmenistan. However, upon returning to Turkmenistan, many migrants faced a 5-year travel ban and were treated as criminals, which created a situation of divided families and social problems related to employment. Because of this, lots of citizens of Turkmenistan are afraid to return to their homeland. According to official data, to March 2023, more than 200,000 passports had been prolonged, but this process has so far affected only a minority of Turkmen migrants, many of whom are abroad illegally, especially in Turkey. In addition, according to the latest reports, starting from March 29, 2023, Turkish authorities began to refuse to accept documents for renewal of residence permits to citizens of Turkmenistan with prolonged passports. This could further aggravate the situation of Turkmen migrants. At the moment, human rights defenders and activists are trying to draw the attention of Turkish migration services to this problem. Due to the lack of legal documents, hundreds of thousands of Turkmen citizens living abroad face problems of employment, obtaining banking services, social protection, etc. According to the Turkish NGO International Refugee Rights Association, 2,426 Turkmen citizens aged 17 years living in Turkey deprived of the rights of education. The data covers the period 2021-2022. The real figure is much higher, since the estimate is made only for legally registered migrants. When preparing documents for children, born abroad, citizens of Turkmenistan also face difficulties due to the refusal of consulates to issue these birth certificates. To obtain them, mothers are also required to return to their homeland, which is not always possible for various reasons. In some cases, employees of the Turkmen consulate in Istanbul refuse to issue prolonged documents of civil activists or their family members, citing their criticism of the government as the reason. For example, activist Zareen Akhtiamov, who has repeatedly applied to the consulate, is each time denied several documents, certificate about absence of marriage, a document for her daughter born in Turkey, and a passport. Alisher Sakhat, who was trying to process documents for his son, who was born in Turkey on January 27, 2022, was denied acceptance of documents due to his critical speeches on social networks. His wife, because of her dialect, was recommended to go to the Uzbekistan consulate for help. Aziz Mamedov, who submitted his passport for prolongation to the Turkmenistan consulate in Istanbul in December 2020, was told that his document was lost and was refused to issue a new one. The issue is still not resolved. In September 2022, at the initiative of Turkmenistan, a visa regime was introduced for short-time trips to Turkey. Since February 2023, there have been reports from citizens who have issued visas for such a trip that some of them, after obtaining a visa, are summoned to the police at their place of residence and required to give a receipt that while abroad they will not participate in protest or political discussions on the internet, comment and like videos criticizing the government. The recommendations, all our recommendations, you can find in our submission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bigmano. It's indeed an in-depth overview of the Turkmen citizen struggle and complete government neglectance to comply with its binding international obligations. The next speaker on my list is Ms. Leyla Seyitbek, representing Freedom for Eurasia, with her pre-recorded statement on political persecution of Turkmen activists in Turkey.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today about the human rights situation in Turkmenistan. My name is Leyla Seyitbek. I am a chairwoman of NGO Freedom for Eurasia. Freedom for Eurasia, jointly with University of Southern California Human Rights Advocacy Group, with substantial support from Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation in Bulgaria, submitted a memorandum to the UPR of Turkmenistan where we summarized concerns regarding Turkmenistan's human rights record. In particular, the submission focuses on human rights violations and transnational repression faced by Turkmenistan citizens, including migrant workers and human rights activists living in Turkey, an important center of Turkmenistan diaspora abroad. This memorandum details the surveillance, travel restrictions, discrimination, and other abuses that Ashgabat and Ankara have increasingly used to control and monitor Turkmens abroad and their relatives who remain in the country. In 2007, the governments of Turkey and Turkmenistan established a system whereby Turkmenistan citizens could legally reside in Turkey for up to 30 days without a tourist visa, which over time evolved to allow them to reside in Turkey continuously without a visa. Despite the Turkish government's long-stated policy of easing travel restrictions for citizens of fellow Turkic-speaking nations, including 4 Central Asian states, the immediate effect of these restrictions was to disenfranchise and discriminate against Turkmenistan citizens, including by revoking rights of hundreds of thousands of people that had previously enjoyed living in Turkey. On May 31st, 2022, media reported that Turkmen authorities initiated talks with Ankara to abolish this agreement, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of Turkmens living illegally in Turkey with no clear pathway to legal residency. Turkey's State Migration Service reported that as of September 2022, there have been approximately 230,000 Turkmen citizens living legally in Turkey, but unofficial estimates place that number much higher. In September 2022, the Turkmenistan government officially requested Turkey impose visa restrictions on Turkmen citizens. On September 13, 2022, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan signed the decree into law which states that Turkmen citizens are no longer eligible to reside in Turkey absent a visa. Following this, hundreds of thousands of Turkmens found themselves living illegally and undocumented in Turkey. As this submission outlines, Turkmen activists and rights defenders in Turkey face an increasingly unsafe environment due to their peaceful human rights work. Turkmen officials and security services engage in widespread surveillance, harassment, and abuses against activists and perceived government critics in Turkey. In some cases, Turkish authorities have been complicit or turned a blind eye to these abuses, including by violating the principle of non-refoulement, the obligation not to return an individual to a country where there is a substantial likelihood he or she could be subjected to torture or ill treatment, in addition to enforced disappearances and politically motivated imprisonment. Over the past 5 years, Turkmenistan has implemented significant restrictions on the freedom of movement of its citizens, and its police and security services have placed wide-ranging restrictions on the issuance of passports and other legal documents. Previously, Turkmen authorities issued and exchanged passports through consular offices abroad, but in recent years have stopped this practice altogether. There has also been a marked increase in the use of transnational repression to persecute, silence, or forcibly return perceived critics who live abroad. In addition, authorities use the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext to largely stop flights in and out of Turkmenistan. While some flights have since resumed, travel routes and the ability to freely leave the country have drastically diminished, placing Turkmens who wish to pursue economic opportunities or greater political freedom abroad in an increasingly difficult predicament, rendering them de facto hostages of their own country. In July 2021, Turkmen authorities approved a procedure to extend the validity of biometric passports of citizens of Turkmenistan in embassies abroad. However, in doing so, Turkmenistan restricted the freedom of movement of its citizens by refusing to extend traditional passports and/or use stamps that serve as passport extensions. Turkmen embassies are not obliged not to extend the validity of passports that expire, but to issue new ones to their citizens. The insert that extends the validity of passports is not recognized as valid in third countries. Furthermore, Turkmens who seek to stay in Turkey face serious difficulty obtaining passport renewals. In one case, a female Turkmen migrant residing in Turkey became an undocumented migrant due to the Turkmen authorities' refusal to renew her passport. In January 2023, Turkish police detained and sent her to a deportation center with her 1-year-old daughter, as her husband was unable to retain custody of their child. Only following the intervention of human rights activists, the Turkmen migrant issued a power of attorney to a relative who took custody of her child. Turkmen women in particular often travel to Turkey seeking work as a result of profound disenfranchisement and barriers to obtaining employment in Turkmenistan, but face difficulties in obtaining passports in foreign consulates. Turkish police have reportedly compiled a list of 25 Turkmen migrants subject to deportation, as directed by the Turkmen consulate. Neither the detained activists nor the Turkish lawyers representing them have been allowed to see the list or learn the legal basis for their detention. Turkmen civil society activists in Turkey are harassed, monitored, and intimidated. Among them are Omurzaku Markuliyev, Aziz Mamedov, Rozыбay Jumamuradov, Dursultan Taganova, Zarina Akhtemova, and others. You can read their stories in our submission in detail. The situation of Tajigul Begmedova, a human rights defender and a Turkmen national who worked as an associate professor at the Institute of National Economy in Ashgabat for 20 years, where she was also involved in social work. Begmedova left Turkmenistan in 2002 due to rising levels of repression under Turkmenistan's first and long-standing autocratic president Saparmurat Niyazov, who gained notoriety for his bizarre cult of personality, including, among other policies, mandating every citizen read his book the Ruhnama, and exalting himself as a godlike figure. After Begmedova left Turkmenistan for Bulgaria in March 2002, Turkmenistan requested Bulgaria to extradite Begmedova and her husband, advancing trumped-up allegations that she was involved in a theft in a bank in Turkmenistan in the summer of 2002, which happened after she had left the country. Bulgaria refused Ashgabat's extradition request on grounds of political persecution and a lack of evidence. Turkmenistan, in response, detained 5 of Begmedova's relatives, fabricated criminal cases against them, and sentenced them to 6 to 8 years in prison. In 2003, Begmedova founded the TurkmenHelsinki Foundation in Bulgaria, which aims to monitor Turkmenistan's human rights situation and the rights of Turkmen citizens abroad. TurkmenHelsinki Foundation provides legal assistance and publishes reports on human rights abuses in Turkmenistan, and has played a significant role in securing the release of Turkmenistan nationals unjustly detained both inside the country and in Turkey. For instance, THF played a critical role in the release of Dosultan Taganova and other Turkmen activists in Turkey in September 2021. The organization also secured the release of Mr. Alaberdiev, a prisoner of conscience, from the Turkmen prison in December 2022, with the assistance of Freedom Now, another human rights organization. Begmedova's family members have suffered at the hands of Turkmen authorities. In 2002, her husband's brother Hajiev and his friend Aman Klichev were illegally detained and tortured by government officials. In 2015, the UN Human Rights Committee recognized the illegality of their detention and torture. In 2018, the same committee held the Turkmen government responsible for the torture and death of Begmedova's sister-in-law, human rights activist Ogulsapar Muradova. However, Turkmen authorities have failed to implement these rulings or uphold their international human rights obligations. In January 2022, Begmedova was denied entry into Turkey, which was assumed to be at the behest of Turkmenistan government. In response, the human rights activists contested this decision, and in February 2023, the Ankara Court of First Instance deemed the ban to be illegal. However, the opposing party has since filed an appeal, and the case is currently undergoing legal proceedings. The challenges faced by Turkmen seeking citizenship in Turkey are part of a broader set of difficulties the community faces in the country. In addition to citizenship, the lack of repatriation services for deceased Turkmen in Turkey has resulted in mass burials in cemeteries such as Kilyos, highlighting the need for improved services and support for this marginalized group. At the Kilyos cemetery, the precise number of Turkmen buried is unknown, but one observes communal graves of Turkmens in 3 parts of a huge cemetery. In March 2020, at least 53 Turkmen citizens who were poisoned with tainted alcohol were buried at the Kilyos cemetery, many of whom were unable to have their bodies sent back to Turkmenistan to be buried. Even greater difficulties ensued regarding the loss of lives due to the catastrophic earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria in February 2023. Activist groups report that lack of passports meant it was extremely difficult for loved ones to identify their dead or to arrange for repatriation of the bodies back to Turkmenistan, resulting in significant difficulties for the deceased families to provide proper burial and mourning services in accordance with their cultural and religious traditions. Thus, the exact number of illegal Turkmens who perish remain unknown. This is due to the fact that some Turkmens possess outdated passports while others have lost their passports altogether. Ultimately, the consulate has failed to address this issue for a prolonged period of time, meaning the government of Turkmenistan is guilty of concealing vital information about the deaths of Turkmen citizens, which is in direct violation of their right to access information. In 2020 and 2021, Turkish authorities categorically refused requests by Turkmen activists to hold protests, in large part due to COVID restrictions in Turkey. In July 2020, 7 activists reported attempting to receive permission from Turkish authorities to protest, but being met with a categorical refusal at the behest of Turkmen authorities. In August 2022, a group of Turkmen activists approached the Turkmen consulate in Istanbul, attempting to deliver a letter addressed to President Serdar Berdimuhamedov. The group was led into the courtyard of the consulate. After trying to hand over a letter to officials, the group was beaten by unknown masked individuals who came out of the side door of the consulate. Representatives of the diplomatic corps beat 2 women and 3 men, with one activist suffering severe head injuries. These individuals assert that the Turkmen consulate has violated their fundamental rights to free expression, assembly, and association. The Turkmen government's crackdown on dissent extends beyond targeting activists and opposition figures, as the authorities also harass and intimidate their family members inside the country. Family members of dissenters, including juveniles as young as 14 years old, are harassed by Turkmen authorities. Taking all of the above into consideration, we urge member states to raise the following recommendations with the governments of Turkmenistan and Turkey at the Turkmenistan's upcoming UPR. Turkmenistan's authorities should immediately seize the ongoing surveillance, harassment, detentions, and forced returns of Turkmen activists, dissidents, and rights defenders abroad, as well as intimidation of their relatives in Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan should withdraw its request for Turkey to introduce visas for Turkmenistan citizens and ensure that all Turkmenistan citizens who lack proper documentation are able to obtain passports and identification documents in their current country of residence. Turkmenistan must also allow those who die in Turkey to have their bodies returned for burial in Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan should take immediate steps to ensure that its citizens are able to exercise their right to free expression, assembly, association without fear of retribution, and bring officials responsible for violating these rights to justice. Turkmenistan should promptly provide accurate and trustworthy information regarding the well-being and whereabouts of Omurza Omurkuliyev. Turkmenistan activists and rights defenders should be treated fairly and provided all protections under international law, and Turkey should allow them to enter the country without fear of reprisals and guarantee their freedom. Thank you very much for your attention.
We are grateful to Ms. Seidberg for her intervention, and it is essential to highlight the repressions of Turkmen government that go even beyond the state borders. I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Steve Sverdlov, a member of Human Rights Advocacy Group, who will present the summary of his submission to Turkmenistan fourth cycle of review.
Good afternoon, esteemed colleagues. My name is Steve Swerdlow, an associate professor of the practice of human rights at the University of Southern California and the director of the USC Human Rights Advocacy Group. We have prepared a joint submission in advance of Turkmenistan's Universal Periodic Review, submitted jointly with Freedom for Eurasia and with substantial contributions from the TurkmenHelsinki Foundation. My colleague has already described some aspects of this joint submission. I will focus on the legal standards that Turkmenistan is governed by, and also look at the experience of individual activists and individual cases of harassment of Turkmens living in Turkey. As we have mentioned, this submission focuses in particular on human rights violations and transnational repression faced by Turkmen citizens, including migrant workers and human rights activists living in Turkey, an important center of Turkmenistan's diaspora. And this situation arises out of the particular decisions by the Turkmenistan and Turkey governments to discontinue the process of renewing expired passports inside of Turkmen consulates in Turkey, which has led to an abysmal situation for hundreds of thousands, if not more, Turkmens residing in Turkey. Many of the rights violations we describe in the submission are related to Turkmenistan's violation of the right of freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and freedom of expression. It is important to remember that Turkmenistan's constitution, specifically Article 25, recognizes the freedoms and norms guaranteed by international law and mandates the granting of these liberties to all citizens. Turkmenistan is a signatory to the ICCPR, which obliges it to protect freedom of expression, including for human rights defenders, as well as protect the right of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. As you will hear and no doubt learn, there are numerous reported cases of violations of these rights in the UPR period, particularly with regard to freedom of expression and association and freedom of movement. As other independent submissions to the UPR attest, Turkmenistan maintains some of the most rigid restrictions on freedom of movement of its own citizens of any country in the world. But these problems extend even further to the considerable population of Turkmen migrants who reside in Turkey. This includes hundreds of thousands of Turkmen migrants and human rights defenders. Turkmenistan's decision to discontinue the renewal of Turkmen passports, issuance of Turkmen passports in Turkmen consulates in Turkey several years ago, has led to severe difficulties and major obstacles that affect everything from the ability to bury one's loved ones to every other aspect, fundamental aspect of daily life for Turkmen migrants living in Turkey. In one case, Dinare Yakubova, a Turkmen migrant residing in Turkey, became an undocumented migrant due to Turkmen authorities' refusal to renew her passport. In January 2023, Turkish police detained her and sent her to a deportation center with her 1-year-old daughter, as her husband was unable to retain custody of their child. Only following the intervention of human rights activist Yakubova issued a power of attorney to a relative who took custody of her child. Turkmen women in particular often face great difficulties traveling to Turkey. They travel to Turkey to seek work as a result of profound disenfranchisement and barriers to obtaining employment inside Turkmenistan, but they face major difficulties obtaining passports in foreign consulates in Turkey. In addition, it is known that Turkish police have reportedly compiled a list of at least 25 Turkmen migrants who are subject to deportation, as directed by the Turkmenistan consulate in Turkey. Neither the detained activists nor Turkish lawyers representing them have been allowed to see their clients or to see this list or learn the legal basis of their detention. In another case, on March 11th, 2022, Turkmen activist Aziz Mamedov's Istanbul apartment was raided by armed police officers. Mamedov had earlier found a large basket of roses and an envelope with his name, as well as the names of 2 other participants in the protest movement, in front of his apartment door. A letter accompanying the gift, which was from an anonymous Turkish citizen claiming to have 2 companies working in Ashgabat, stated the author's intention to provide financial and moral support to the critics of the Turkmen regime. The author also included a WhatsApp number for contacting him that would be activated between midnight and 1:30 a.m. However, upon inspection, Mamedov found a package containing light gray powder, metal balls, an oily liquid, wires, and a Samsung phone battery at the bottom of the basket of roses. A group of police officers then burst into Mamedov's apartment, pulled him out, examined his phone. He told police officers about the events preceding the raid. And it all appears to have been a trend, a part of a way to lure Mamedov into danger, and a tactic of transnational repression that Turkmen authorities have become now well known for. Another extremely concerning case that we hope the UPR will register concern over is the case of Omrozak Omar Kuliyev, a Turkmen student who was studying in Turkey and was lured back to Turkmenistan by the government in early 2018 under the pretext of participating in parliamentary elections as an observer. Omar Kuliyev had founded the Society of Solidarity of Turkmen Students, an organization that provided space for Turkmen students studying in Turkey to connect and network, and which caught the attention of Turkmen authorities and the Turkmen embassy in Turkey. Omar Kuliyev was invited to return to Turkmenistan, ostensibly to meet with deputies in Turkmenistan's Meclis, the Central People's Council, and to share his ideas on reform and election participation. On February 14, 2018, Omar Kuliyev returned to Turkmenistan to participate in the promised events alongside Azad Japarov, a man pretending to be a student and a representative of Turkmen students at the Turkmen consulate. Japarov was a close associate of the Ministry of National Security of Turkmenistan, and after returning, Omar Kuliyev was prevented from leaving the country and slept at the airport for 10 days until he disappeared. He's believed to have been detained at this point. Now, little is known about what happened to Omar Kuliyev afterwards. It's believed that he was in prison until September 2019, when he resurfaced in a YouTube video by Dovlet Murat Yazkuliyev, a well-known state-controlled journalist who commonly makes pro-government videos while claiming to be independent. The video aimed to prove Turkmenistan government's claims that Omar Kuliyev is alive, and that he was serving in the army. However, discrepancies in the video suggest that it was fabricated, and Omar Kuliyev's whereabouts and conditions remain unknown. In March 2023, Turkmen representatives at the 137th session of the UN Committee on Human Rights in Geneva claimed Omar Kuliyev now resides at home in Turkmenistan. However, due to lack of evidence corroborating the statement, Omar Kuliyev's status remains unknown. Another well-known case of harassment and pressure on an activist from the Turkmen human rights community in Turkey is the case of Dorsultan Taganova. Dorsultan Taganova was a Turkmen migrant worker who became a politically active figure by attending Turkmen opposition rallies and sharing anti-government statements on social media in 2020 at the height of the COVID pandemic. She became the face of the Turkmen opposition movement abroad after spending 3 months in a deportation facility following her arrest at a protest in front of the Turkmen consulate in Istanbul. Her activism rose out of her outrage over the Turkmen government's weak response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Following a rally on July 19, 2020 to condemn the government's inadequate response to the pandemic, Taganova was detained along with other protesters and held in a facility after the protest was dispersed by Turkish police. The consulate accused her and 4 others of interfering with the work of Turkmen diplomats and threatening violence against them. Although the accusation was dismissed, Taganova remained in custody and she was eventually released in October 2020 after the intervention of 11 human rights organizations. Taganova's family has been pressured to publicly denounce her opposition actions, and she has become the target of a smear campaign by Turkmenistan officials. She's under constant threat and risk. Her family has also come under scrutiny, with several members questioned by Turkmen police and forced to call her a traitor on a video recording. In another well-known case of transnational repression, in August 2022, a group of Turkmen activists approached the Turkmen consulate in Istanbul, attempting to deliver a letter addressed to President Serdar Berdimuhamedov. The group was led into a courtyard of the consulate. After trying to hand the letter to officials peacefully, they were surrounded and beaten by unknown masked individuals, most likely those working at the consulate. This was a violent beating which ended up injuring not only women and men, but children, with at least one activist suffering severe head injuries. And all of this is part of a concerted and ongoing effort to pressure and intimidate the family members of activists and peaceful dissidents living in Turkey and pressuring their families back in Turkmenistan. We urge member states to raise the following recommendations with governments of Turkmenistan and Turkey at Turkmenistan's upcoming UPR. Turkmenistan authorities should immediately cease ongoing surveillance, harassment, detention, forced returns of Turkmen activists, dissidents, and rights defenders abroad, as well as the intimidation of their relatives in Turkmenistan. 2. Turkmenistan should withdraw its request for Turkey to introduce visas or to maintain visas for Turkmenistan citizens and ensure that all Turkmenistan citizens who lack the proper documentation are able to obtain passports and identification documents in their current country of residence in accordance with obligations under the ICCPR and a whole host of other human rights instruments. Third, Turkmenistan must allow those who die in Turkey to have their bodies repatriated for burial in Turkmenistan. Fourth, Turkmenistan should take immediate steps to ensure that its citizens are able to exercise their free rights of expression, assembly, association, religion without fear of retribution, and bring officials responsible for these abuses to justice. Fifth, Turkmenistan should promptly provide accurate accounting of political prisoners, including the disappeared, and the whereabouts of individuals such as Omruzak Umarkaliyev. Sixth, Turkmenistan activists and rights defenders should be treated fairly and provided all protections under international law, and Turkey should live up to its obligation to allow them to enter the country without fear of reprisals and guarantee their freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sverdlov. The extent to which the government of Turkmenistan backlashes at its critics has no limit, and that is why the people of Turkmenistan are forcibly silenced and deprived of their basic freedom of expression. Now I'll present you a statement on behalf of a dedicated human rights defender who, due to the safety reasons, wish to remain unrevealed. The standard of living of Turkmen citizens, as well as the number of population, is failing sharply against the backdrop of widespread unemployment and corruption, which is literally strangling the people. Although it is possible at the legislative level to file a complaint about human rights violation, in practice all these complaints remain ineffective, not to mention covering the problems of the people in the mass media. It would be appropriate to note here that the media in the country are completely under the control of the authoritarian state. Citizens who ever gave interviews to foreign media, worked as journalists, or engaged in activism were sentenced to long prison terms and subjected to tortures. Namely, Ogulsapar Muradova, Agurjuma Bayramov, Mansur Mingelov, Nurgildi Khalikov, and Murat Dushemov. The country's repressive policies, which are destroying civil societies at the root, are literally forcing citizens of Turkmenistan to leave the country. Notably, the Turkmen people are oppressed not only with the country, but also outside its borders. Even fleeing the country is not a solution to the problem. Every year, the conditions for leaving the country became more and more strict. New obstacles are created to somehow stop the migration of the already small population. Instead of respecting human rights, which the official authorities declare from such a high tribunes as the UN and the OSCE, the government is busy tightening the screws and suppressing the will of people, thereby further aggravating the situation of people. Mostly, labor migrants from Turkmenistan choose Turkey and Russia. Turkmen citizens who escaped from the country after the expiration of the biometric passports became illegal immigrants in the host countries, since diplomatic missions of Turkmenistan abroad refused to renew passports for their citizens in the violation of the International Convention. To obtain a new passport, labor migrants are advised to go back to the Turkmenistan and get a new passport there. But realizing that having received a new passport, the likelihood of leaving Turkmenistan is extremely small, Turkmen citizens prefer to remain in the host country as illegal immigrants, even despite their powerless situation. Thus, Turkmen people who are powerless in their homeland remain just as powerless outside of the country. In 2022, Turkey, at the request of the Turkmen side, introduced a visa regime. Turkmenistan is seeking the forced return of activists based abroad. Now, Turkey itself, pursuing its geopolitical interests, is actively detaining and deporting citizens of Turkmenistan to their homeland, cancelling their residence permits that were issued legally. Among them are civil activists who face long prison sentences and tortures in Turkmenistan. Starting in May of this year, bloggers Farhad Muimankuliyev, Rovshan Klichev, Davran Imamov, Maksat Baymuradov, and Serdar Durdaliyev were deported to their homeland from Turkey. In Turkmenistan, relatives of these and other activists are subject to harassment and threats from the authorities. And with this being said, I would like to pass the floor to Kate Waters from the Crude Accountability, who will comment on the proof They Are Alive, the campaign that aims to discover information and protect the rights of a large number of detainees serving long-term sentences in Turkmen prisons.
Hello, my name is Kate Waters. I'm the Executive Director of Crude Accountability.
a human rights and environmental nonprofit organization that works in the Caspian Basin in communities that are impacted by oil and gas development. We are also a founding member of the Prove They Are Alive campaign, which since 2013 has documented, monitored, and advocated on the issue of enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan. This is the issue that I want to focus on today, which is based on the recommendations and on the statement that the Crude Accountability submitted to the UPR earlier this year. For 2 decades, Turkmenistan has used enforced disappearances as a systemic means of torture and intimidation of its citizens. The Prove They Are Alive campaign has documented 162 cases of enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan. And I want to underscore that this is not a historic practice, but rather one that continues to the present day. Of the 162 individuals who have been forcibly disappeared, 96 are considered by the Prove They Are Alive campaign to be cases of continued disappearances. That is, ongoing right now. We know that 29 individuals have died in custody. We know that 10 have been released, and we know that 30 continue to serve their sentences, but are no longer considered forcibly disappeared because they receive food parcels and family visitation. Very disturbingly, of these cases of ongoing disappearances, 32 of the 96 current cases include individuals who have served their full prison sentences, but have not been released and continue to be forcibly disappeared in the Turkmenistan prison system. Where are these people, and why have they not been released? Since the third cycle of the UPR, the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances has issued 3 communications to the government of Turkmenistan regarding cases of enforced disappearances, and I want to describe them very briefly. In 2018, the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances issued a communication about the case of Anamurad Addayev, who was forcibly disappeared in December 2016 for alleged membership in an Islamic extremist group after he refused to inform the government of Turkmenistan about the activities of his fellow students at the university where he was studying in Egypt. His wife, Daria Addayeva, a Russian citizen, attempted to see her husband in prison but was denied access. She faced reprisals later from the Russian authorities and was forced to flee Russia and is now seeking asylum. In 2019, the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances issued a communication regarding the alleged enforced disappearances and deaths in custody of at least 27 individuals due to torture, inhumane treatment, degrading detention conditions, and denial of medical assistance in the Turkmen prison system, in particular at the maximum security prison Ovadan Depe. The communication regarded 121 cases, which was what the Prove They Are Alive campaign's list was at that point, of enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan, and 27 related deaths since 2006. Among these is the case of Ogul Supar Muradova, a human rights defender who was forcibly disappeared in June of 2006. Ms. Muradova died in custody, allegedly of torture, although the government of Turkmenistan denied any wrongdoing. In 2018, the UN Human Rights Committee found the government of Turkmenistan responsible for the torture and death in custody of Ms. Muradova. As recently as March 2, 2023, so this year, the government of Turkmenistan, in official dialogue with the UN Human Rights Committee, stated that Ms. Muradova had committed suicide in prison. And thirdly, in 2021, the Working Group, again, on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, in tandem with the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights Defenders, and the Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression, issued a communication to the Turkmen government concerning the case of Mr. Nurgeldi Halikov, a journalist and human rights defender who was disappeared in July 2020. More details about these cases and others can be found in our written submission, which you have.
But I want to close my comments today to highlight the recommendations that Accrued Accountability made with its submission earlier this year for the government of Turkmenistan. 1. Immediately and unconditionally release those prisoners who have completed their terms and offer reparations to them and their families. Secondly, immediately and unconditionally cease the practice of enforced disappearances, allowing prisoners visitation, receipt of letters and packages, access to medical care, and access to legal counsel, in line with the amended Code of Criminal Procedure and obligations undertaken by Turkmenistan within the Universal Periodic Review. If any individual in the disappeared list has died, family members should be provided with the death certificate and the location of the remains. Fourth, provide immediate access to Turkmen prisons, including high-security Ovadan Tepe, for independent observers such as the ICRC, relevant mandate holders of UN special procedures, human rights NGOs, and other authoritative international bodies such as the OSCE, ODIHR, and facilitate a visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. 5. Immediately initiate judicial reviews of all the court cases of the disappeared in light of the 2010 amendments to the Criminal Code, allowing international monitors to observe the proceedings. 6. Acknowledge the cases of Ogul Supar Muradova, Batir Berdiev, Rustem Jumayev, Serdar Rahimov, and Boris Shikhmuradov as cases of enforced disappearance. Bring the ruling on Ms. Muradova's death by the Turkmenistani government into agreement with the ruling of the Human Rights Council in 2018, acknowledging responsibility for it and retracting the statement that Ms. Muradova's death was a suicide. The government of Turkmenistan should also conduct an immediate and impartial investigation into those cases raised by the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances and resume dialogue with the Working Group on these cases and all others. And finally, immediately abolish the 2003 decree of the Halk Maslahati, the People's Council, on high treason, which introduced imprisonment for life as a punishment for treason. This decree contradicts the 2010 Criminal Code.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Waters. It is of particular importance to uncover the truth of the fate of those hundreds imprisoned Turkmen citizens as a result of repressions launched by Turkmenistan government. Now I would like to open the floor for any questions, comments, or remarks from the participants in the session. Okay, Mr. Harjiev would like to add some closing remarks, so I will help him translating.
Туркменская делегация сегодня сказала такие слова. В Туркменистане существует социальная политика.
Today, the Turkmen delegation during their report stated that there is a social policy in Turkmenistan.
Какая-то социальная политика, когда люди стоят за хлебом, хлеба не хватает. Какая-то социальная политика, когда карточки продуктовые существуют.
But what we call a social policy when people are lacking the bread and they need to wait in lines for hours to get some bread, and there is literally carts to get the food in Turkmenistan.
Какая-то социальная политика, когда есть массовая безработица, и туркменская молодежь массово выезжает в сопредельные страны, Турцию, Россию и другие сопредельные страны, ищут там работу.
How can we call it a social policy when there is a massive unemployment in Turkmenistan and thousands of Turkmenistan youth, they are forced to flee the country to bordering states like Russia and Turkey to find the job?
Какая-то социальная политика, когда люди выезжают лечиться в сопредельные страны, даже в Иран, в Индию, в Турцию и другие страны, для того, чтобы поправить свое здоровье.
How can we call it a social policy when people are lacking proper medical treatment and they are forced to go to neighboring countries like Iran, India, Russia and Turkey to have the proper medical treatment?
При этом в Туркменистане построено клептократическое государство, развит непотизм, когда власть принадлежит отцу как председателю парламента, а сыну как президенту.
And what is the social policy when there is a high level of nepotism and kleptocracy in the country? When the father leads the parliament and the son is the president of the state.
При этом семья Бердымухамедов тратит миллиарды, я повторяю, долларов для того, чтобы строить бесполезные для народа объекты и наживаться на этом.
And meanwhile, the family of Berdimuhamedov spends billions and billions of dollars, right?
И наживаться на этом.
Of dollars by constructing useless things for the society, and they achieving ill-gotten money from that.
Сегодня прозвучали еще слова, что будут построены 2 тюрьмы или 2 колонии. Вот об этом о чем идет речь. То есть будут новые посадки и будут новые жертвы этой диктатуры.
Today, the Turkmen government representative stated that 2 prisons will be built in Turkmenistan, and that even more constitutes to the fact that new repressions are coming and new victims are going to emerge.
Вот 2 решения Комитета ООН по правам человека.
Here are the 2 decisions of the Human Rights Committee.
Моего брата и моей сестры.
Of my brother and my sister.
Никто не выполняет.
And nobody's complying with these decisions.
Сестру убили в тюрьме.
My sister was killed in prison.
Вот он, демократический Туркменистан.
That's all that you have to know about the democratic Turkmenistan.
Готовы ответить на ваши вопросы.
Yeah, we are looking forward to your questions and remarks. Yeah, the European Union.
Dear panelists, thank you sincerely for these very interesting and also empowering testimonies. I would like to ask a bit on a more general note, if you could speak to the overall development of the human rights situation in Turkmenistan since they were last out of the Universal Periodic Review, so as to get a sense of the way in which things are going. Now we heard a lot of individual examples, but if we can have like some more global tendencies, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I just translated it to our speaker.
Значит, с момента последнего ревью я хочу сказать, что практически никаких движений нету.
Since the last Universal Periodic Review, there's literally no improvements in the human rights situation in the country.
Почему? Потому что для международной общественности они, конечно, принимают какие-то законы, подписывают какие-то соглашения, подписываются под договорами, но на практике они практически ничего не выполняют.
For international community, they pretend to sign some documents, some agreements, but in practice they do not fulfill their international obligations at any level.
То есть все это делается для международной общественности, а для внешнего потребления, для внутреннего потребления никаких изменений нет.
It's been done only for increasing visibility and pretending to be in a democratic state for international community, but there is literally no improvements within the country for the people living in Turkmenistan.
Я хочу добавить маленькую ремарку. Конечно, в сравнении с режимом Сапармурата Ниязова, нынешний режим не такой агрессивный и не так открыто сопротивляется инициативам международных организаций, например, Европейского Союза.
Compared to the previous regime of Niyazov, the current regime is less aggressive, and it wants to work more in with the European institutions.
They don't want, they say they want.
They pretend to work more with the European institutions.
И такое ощущение, что они усыпляют бдительность международных организаций, словами, что да, сделают, но на самом деле, к сожалению, годами это не делается.
They are trying, they're doing their best to pretend for the international community to not attract so much attention to Turkmenistan, that they do comply with the international norms and obligations, but in reality, nothing as such is done. Thank you. So I believe that the all questions that we had today, and we're deeply grateful for your participation in this event. We strongly believe that these testimonies will contribute to the recommendation of Turkmenistan from your states, and it will strengthen the collaboration between human rights defenders and international society. So thank you so much for coming, and we look for more in-depth collaboration and discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.